Welcome back to Mr. Wicklam's virtual classroom, where today what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at multiplying integers. When we multiply integers, it's just the same as multiplying numbers. When we've learned about multiplication before, we've learned about how a number is just however many groups of that number. Okay, so that was the kind of the simple um, version of multiplication. Then we moved into something called the associative property. The associative property is nothing new. It's 2 times 6, which equals 12, or 6 times 2, which equals 12. So all it is basically it's just flipping the numbers. Okay, that's the associative property. All right, so it works regardless of whatever you are doing, whether you're using integers, just negative numbers, positive numbers, doesn't matter. Okay, it still works. So that's why it's just a little bit of a review of where we've come from. Next is the distributive property. Now, I don't know if you've heard of the distributive property or not. If you have, great. If you haven't, that's fine. The distributive property just basically means we're going to break this down. We're going to break down 2 times 4 plus 5. Okay? And when we break that down, basically what we do is we distribute these. So what that means is that we are multiplying, so 2 times 4 plus 2 times 5. So what you get is you get 8 plus 10, which equals 18. That's the distributive property. Now, today, we're not really going to be looking too much into the distributive property. We're going to be doing more of the grouping and adding so that you can see what happens when we multiply integers. Now, we've dealt with positive numbers for most of our math career up to this point. Okay, and so what I mean is by positive number is 2 times 6 or 6 times 2. We've dealt with those numbers and we know that when they are both positives, we get a positive answer. Okay, so that's never going to change. Now, what happens when we mix a negative number with a positive number? Well, when we mix a negative number with a positive number, and this is going to be rule number one states that a negative times a positive will give you a negative answer. So you have a negative, you multiply it by a positive, and it's always going to give you a negative answer. Okay? Now, rule number two, I have two negatives. What happens when I multiply a negative times a negative? Great question. When I multiply a negative times a negative, I actually get a positive. And you're probably asking me, Mr. Wickham, how in the world do I get a positive from two negatives? Well, let's take a look. Let's investigate. Here's the normal positive times a positive. Positive times a positive, 3 times 2, is basically like saying I have three groups of 2. So 2 plus 2 plus 2. So I have three groups of 2 that I'm going to be doing, or I could have two groups of 3. So 3 plus 3. Either way, so I have three groups of 2, or I have two groups of 3, right? 3. Either way, what I get is my answer is going to be 6. 3 times 2 is 6. You know that. We know that. Okay, let's move on. Negative and a positive. Now, all of a sudden, what I have is I have 3 times negative 2. So how does that work? Well, I basically have negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2. Okay, so I have three groups of negative 2. Still makes sense. Okay, not doing anything different other than this is now a negative. Okay, or what I could have is I could have two groups of -3. So pretend this is the negative and this is the positive. That's the associative property. Okay? So I have -3 minus 3. Okay? -3, -3. Two of them. So when I do that, what does my answer become? Well, my answer is -6. Okay? So -2 plus -2 plus -2 is going to give me -6. And -3 minus 3 is also going to give me -6. So what happens when I have a negative times a positive? That's what I told you up here. The answer is going to be a negative. And then I'm just showing you how that happens, why that happens. Okay? Now, what happens when I have a negative and I'm going to multiply it by a negative? Now, you got to follow me here. So it's like, how can I have -3 groups of -2? Well, let's just say we have 3 groups, but they're all negatives of -2. So my first one is a negative. And as you can see here, it is. I'm switching pens for a second. There's the negative. I'm going to start negative right here. Okay? So I start with a negative, and then I have -2. I'm subtracting by -2 each time. The reason I'm subtracting is because it's always negative. All right? I'm not adding now. I'm actually going to be subtracting because that's what this tells me to do. Okay? And so if I want to add, I can. And really, when I have double negatives in front, it turns that into a positive. So 2 double negatives plus 2 double negative plus 2. Okay? Can you see that? Remember, when I have a negative and I have a negative here, that turns that into a positive 2. It's like you're adding. Okay? Now, on the flip side, I have -3 minus -3, right? 3, 2, like I've been doing all along. And what that gives me is that actually gives me +3 plus 3. Well, all those equal 6. Okay? So when I have 2 negatives, it's always going to give me a positive. Okay? That's 2 negatives. So hence, even number of negatives in the multiplication equation is going to give me a positive number. So let's break this down. I hope that math made sense to you, because that's how we break it down, by doing the addition, by doing the groups. Okay, so I'm hoping that made sense. Well, let's break this down. Okay, so if you have one negative, if you're multiplying and your equation has one negative or an odd number of negatives, okay, I'm going to put that in brackets, or an odd number of negatives, the answer is negative. Now, if you have 2 negatives or an even number of negatives, then the answer is going to be positive. Now, I threw one caveat in there. The caveat is, unless it is 0. If it's 0, there is no -0, there is no +0, there is just 0. Okay, so if I have -2 times -2 times -2 times 0, 0. That's the answer. Okay, so I got a what if question. All right, what if I have -2 times -2 times -2? Well, I have 1, 2, 3. I said in my rule that if I have an odd number of negatives, the answer is going to be negative. So what's 2 times 2? 4 times 2 is 8. My answer is going to be -8. Because if I break this down, 2 times is going to give me 4. Okay? Because 2 negatives is going to give me a positive, which it does. It gives me 4. Then, so I'm going to do that over here. Negative 2 times negative 2 times negative 2. Because I want you to see this. Okay, so when I break this down, these two numbers right here, negative 2 times negative 2, are going to give me 4. Positive 4. 2 negatives, even number of negatives, gives me a positive, I have 4. I'm going to multiply that now times negative 2. Well, now all of a sudden, in my equation, I only have one negative. Well, if you have an odd amount of negatives, the answer is going to be negative, which is going to give me negative 8. Or 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. I count the amount of negatives, 1, 2, 3. I know that if I have an odd number, the answer is going to be negative, which it is. I'm just trying to show you two different ways. Okay? Now let's take a look at this right here. I have negative 2 times 2 times negative 2. Okay? So let's break this down. First of all, I could say to myself, okay, I have 1, 2 negatives. Mr. Wickham told me earlier that if I have 2 negatives, the answer is always going to be a positive. So I should know then that my answer is going to be 8. Because 2 negatives means positive. Let's break it down and let's see why. So I have 2 times 2, which equals negative 4, right? 1 negative, answer is negative. 1 negative, 2 times negative 2 times 2, my answer is negative 4. I multiply that by negative 2. All of a sudden, I'm back to this. I have 2 negatives, the answer is positive. So I have an even number of negatives, my answer is positive. 4 times 2 equals 8. Okay? I hope you can see that. There's really two simple rules when we're multiplying integers. If I have an odd amount of negatives, the answer is always going to be negative. If I have an even amount of negatives, the answer is going to be positive. So if I have 6 negatives in my equation, I'm going to end up with a positive. If I have 17 negatives in my equation, it's going to be negative because it's an odd number. That's what we need to keep in mind. If you have an odd number of negatives, the answer is negative. If you have an even number of negatives, the answer is always going to be positive. Caveat being, unless it is 0. All right? That's all I have for you today. That was multiplying integers with Mr. Wickham.